Welcome to the deep dive. You've brought us a really fascinating piece of source material today, Chapter 20, titled The Era of Mass Economic Enlightenment Begins.
It's definitely thought-provoking.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the bold vision presented in this chapter for a pretty fundamental economic transformation. We're going to explore what a world after something called the shift might look like. Try to understand the core mechanics of this SETS system that underpins it all.
Right.
And even dig into the mathematical equation that apparently defines its critical turning point.
Yeah, what jumps out immediately is how this chapter doesn't just stick to theory. It really paints a vivid picture of a near-future world.
Okay.
It illustrates a society where a concept called SETS-Backed Fiat Critical Mass, or CBFCM, has already been reached. So we'll be exploring these envisioned outcomes. It's important to stress these are presented as theoretical possibilities.
Right, theoretically.
Yeah. Showing us how this system could function, if fully implemented and successful. It's a glimpse into the potential future this system aims for.
Okay, let's dive right into that future then. The chapter starts by immersing us in the year 2038. That's 15 years after this shift.
Yeah.
We're introduced to the daily lives of the Chen family in Chicago, and it's illustrating a world that seems radically transformed by this new economic reality. The story opens with Maya Chen returning to her apartment in Chicago's South Side, which is described as revitalized.
Right.
What's so striking about this future scene, especially considering, the South Side's history?
Well, it's a powerful narrative choice, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it showcases the system's theoretical outcomes in a very tangible way. The chapter really emphasizes that the transformation of areas like Chicago's South Side, now bustling with locally owned businesses, affordable housing, it isn't the result of, say, government mandates or some kind of charity program. Instead, it's presented as a direct consequence of a fundamental change in how money itself operates within the economy. It's a vision of what might be possible when an economic system, truly reflects broader participation.
Okay, so Maya's daughter, Zoe, she excitedly tells her mom she has $230.45. This immediately brings up the core concept of this chapter. SETS. So what exactly are SETS?
Good question. The chapter explains SETS, that stands for Consumer Earned Tokenized Equity, were introduced back in the 2020s as a kind of parallel system to traditional money.
Parallel, okay.
It points out the global economy was facing, a crisis. Fiat currency, money whose value comes from government trust, not something intrinsic, was showing cracks. SETS were designed apparently not to replace dollars and euros, but to actively reinforce them.
How? How do they reinforce them?
By directly connecting money to real economic activity. That's the key idea.
Interesting.
Precisely. And the chapter lays out 4 key mechanisms for how SETS are supposed to work. First, earning. People get SETS as a reward when they buy from participating businesses.
Okay, that sounds a bit like cashback or points programs we have now.
It does sound similar, but there's a crucial difference the chapter highlights. Unlike typical cashback, which is really just a discount, SETS are designed as a store of value.
A store of value.
Yes, something that appreciates over time because they're directly tied to real economic output. They're not just a rebate. The idea is they're like a tiny share in the growing economy that you passively earn.
Ah, okay, that is different. So how do businesses get involved, and what are these SETS actually made of? The chapter mentions random tokenized digital assets. That sounds a bit vague.
It does, but that brings us to the second mechanism, business pledges. Businesses essentially buy SETS from legacy systems, and this is funded by pledges of their actual revenue.
Okay, revenue pledges.
And what's fascinating here is how the chapter explains what SETS are comprised of these random tokenized digital assets. Think of it like this. Instead of just being backed by government trust, your SETS are backed by a diverse portfolio of actual digital assets.
Like what? Bitcoin.
It could include Bitcoin, yeah, but potentially also other digital representations of real-world things. The system itself chooses them, apparently. This is supposed to make SETS more resilient.
Okay.
And it helps bridge the gap between, speculative crypto and mainstream finance. The aim is to make digital assets a viable part of a stable economic system.
So they're not like points that expire. They're an actual asset, a store of value. How do they then circulate back into the broader economy?
Right, that's the third and fourth point. Third, SETS gain value over time precisely because they represent actual economic output. And fourth, circulation. After a holding period, SETS can be converted back to dollars through a regulated exchange.
Oh.
And this is key because it puts those dollars back into circulation, directly connecting the fiat supply to real economic activity.
So the chapter highlights that sets reinforce fiat, they don't replace it.
Exactly. By tying money directly to productive economic activity. And that critical threshold, the CBFCM, SETS-Backed Fiat Critical Mass, is reached when around 40% of all transactions become connected to this system.
40%.
At that point, the idea is that money is no longer just backed by trust in government. It's functionally backed by actual goods and services being produced and consumed.
And that critical mass, that 40%, is what enables these profound changes we see in the 2038 narrative, right?
Right.
The chapter showcases several pretty compelling hypothetical benefits.
Yes, hypothetical but illustrative.
For instance, in education, Zoe gets a 1.5x multiplier on SETs transferred to her education account. And she earns 1.2x on educational software purchases from companies with higher SETs pledge rates, like 7% versus maybe a minimum 5%.
Right, so it incentivizes learning directly and also supports businesses that invest more back into the system.
And the impact is beyond individuals to community funding. Maya's neighborhood association funds a new community center using local SETs pools.
Yeah, and the chapter even mentions a Florida coastline restoration project. Apparently it had stalled for years.
Right.
But now it's fully funded through a mix of tax dollars and these community SETs pools. It's a powerful illustration of how local economic activity could, theoretically, directly fuel public works.
Then there's Grandfather Zhang in the story. He talks about the absence of traditional recessions. He describes the economy expanding and contracting more naturally, like tides rather than tsunamis. Because money is so directly connected to real things, it suggests a more stable economic rhythm.
A fundamental shift in stability, potentially.
But it seems to encourage wealth circulation, too. Holding SETs encourages people to put money back into the economy. Grandfather Zhang uses his SETs to help his cousin start an engineering firm, and he even earns an entrepreneur multiplier for investing in a new business.
And the family's own business evolves too. Their tech repair shop becomes a sustainable electronics manufacturer. They maintain a higher SETs pledge rate, 9%, specifically to attract customers. Customers even get a green multiplier on purchases because the business specializes in sustainable electronics. This shows how businesses might compete differently, not just on price, but on their SETs pledge rates, their sustainability metrics.
Yeah.
The chapter really does paint a vivid picture of how the system could shift economic behavior and maybe even values.
So this does raise an important question for you, the listener. If a system like this, like SETs, were actually in place, where your everyday spending could directly fund community projects or earn you multipliers for things like education, how might that change your own daily financial decisions? Would you maybe prioritize certain businesses or certain types of spending more? Something to think about.
Definitely.
Okay, so the Chen family story gives us this glimpse into the future, but how does such a fundamental economic shift actually happen? The chapter then pivots, taking us from the narrative to the underlying mechanics.
Right. It introduces a character, GT Sage, to explain the crucial tipping point, this SETS-Backed Fiat Critical Mass, or CBFCM.
And it tackles the big question. When does the accumulation of these SETs, funded by real-world activity, reach a point where fiat currency is essentially functionally backed by SETs, shifting from just trust-based to, well, asset-backed?
Exactly. And this section digs into what the chapter identifies as the inherent weaknesses of traditional fiat money. You know, for over a century, it's operated on this foundation of trust that, let's face it, can sometimes feel fragile. It points out three core issues. First, its lack of intrinsic value. Second, how inflation and stagnation can erode purchasing power, often by accumulating wealth at the top instead of circulating efficiently.
Right, the circulation problem.
And third, its disconnection from real-world goods and services, which can lead to those erratic downturns and instability we see. The SET system is presented here as a potential solution to these weaknesses.
Providing that direct tether to real economic activity.
Yes, acting as a stabilizing force, crucially, rather than a replacement for fiat.
So let's reiterate that the SET solution isn't about replacing fiat, it's about reinforcing it. The chapter explains SETs aren't a currency themselves. You can't, go buy coffee with SETs directly.
Right.
They have to be held, creating this store of economic value tied to real-world activity. Businesses pledge real revenue into them, ensuring their value is backed by tangible economic participation. And for consumers, you passively build wealth over time by accumulating SETs based on your economic contributions.
And that's where the math comes in. The chapter introduces the core mathematical relationship, describing this shift to SETS-Backed Fiat Critical Mass. M equals alpha F.
Oh, okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So M represents the total market valuation of all the transactions backed by SETs.
Okay, the SETS economy size, sort of.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
Then alpha, that's the threshold percentage. The chapter identifies this as approximately 40%. That's the tipping point required for fiat to functionally transition to an asset-backed model.
The magic
The
40%.
proposed magic 40%, yes. And F represents the total fiat supply in circulation, all the dollars, euros, etc. This equation basically defines the milestone at which economies could, theoretically, transition from being purely fiat-dependent to these hybrid asset-backed systems. The goal stated is ensuring long-term sustainability and shared prosperity.
Okay, M equals alpha F. So for listeners who aren't economists, how can we visualize hitting that 40%? What does it feel like when an economy reaches that point, according to the chapter?
That's a good way to put it. Think of it like this. Imagine a boat that's been sailing on open, sometimes really choppy seas, totally reliant on the skill of the captain, maybe the central bank.
Okay.
Now imagine that once 40% of its cargo is connected to a new kind of ballast system sets a system that sort of self-stabilizes based on the cargo itself. Well, the boat inherently becomes more stable. It's less prone to getting tossed around or even capsizing in a storm.
So the captain, the central institutions, they're still there.
They're still there, yes. But the fundamental stability starts coming more from within the system itself, tied to that real cargo, the real economy. This critical 40% threshold signifies a point where SETs could potentially stabilize market fluctuations and provide a new mechanism for sustainable monetary expansion.
Right.
Once crossed, the idea is that fiat's valuation becomes anchored to this consumer-driven economic participation, shifting some economic influence from purely centralized institutions towards more decentralized, consumer-driven networks.
And again, the chapter emphasizes this doesn't mean the end of fiat. SETs act more like an economic shock absorber, ensuring fiat remains resilient.
That's the concept. Another compelling aspect the chapter mentions is how SETs are theorized to grow exponentially, unlike fiat, which tends to grow more linearly.
Exponentially? How?
Well, as more businesses and consumers adopt them, the network effect kicks in. More participation generates more SETs, which back more value, which encourages more participation, and so on.
Like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. As SETs accumulate, the valuation of the real-world goods and services they represent rises proportionally, reinforcing economic stability. This exponential growth is presented as key to reaching and surpassing that 40% threshold, leading to potentially a new stabilization phase for fiat.
And this transformation isn't just pictured for, say, the U.S. The chapter gives a global perspective too, right?
It does. It includes a segment with students from Brazil, Nigeria, and India, all demonstrating how their countries hypothetically implemented the SET system and reached that CBFCM point.
What were some examples?
Well, the Nigerian student, Adebayo, explained how their system helped stabilize the Naira. It was no longer solely reliant on, say, volatile oil prices, because it was now backed by the full range of economic activity in the country through SETs.
Interesting.
Then Isabella from Brazil shared how the SET system supposedly transformed the Amazon region. Higher SETs multipliers for sustainable practices actually made rainforest preservation more profitable than deforestation.
Wow, changing the economic incentives that drastically.
That's the idea presented. And Prisha from India demonstrated how rural villages used community SETs pools to fund infrastructure, like solar microgrids.
Solar microgrids.
Yeah, projects that maybe big governments or corporations had overlooked for decades, but were now supposedly possible through these collectively earned SETs.
It really is. I mean, funding local infrastructure in rural India through community pools generated from everyday commerce, that's a world away from traditional economic development models. It feels almost revolutionary in its simplicity. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the chapter describes this whole shift as a subtle revolution.
That's the term they use, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not portrayed as some violent overthrow, but a profound gradual change in how people relate to money and maybe to each other. Economic power gradually decentralizes, communities gain more control over their own destinies, and the wealth gap potentially narrows.
And importantly, not through forced redistribution.
Right? Not forced, but through a system that naturally circulates wealth by rewarding different kinds of behaviors, participation, sustainability, community investment.
So this new system, as outlined in Chapter 20, encourages collaboration over exploitation, long-term thinking over just short-term gains, and circulation over hoarding.
That's the vision.
The chapter even touches on how SETs could integrate with existing financial structures, including stablecoins. What did it say about that?
It suggests stablecoins could actually be included as fractionalized assets within the SETS baskets.
Oh, okay.
This could ensure compatibility with emerging regulatory frameworks and potentially even fortify the dollar's role in a digital economy. It positions SETS not as an antagonist, but as a cooperative force, bridging legacy finance with this potential future of economic participation.
This really does raise an important question for you, the listener, to consider. The chapter suggests that maybe for the first time, digital assets and traditional fiat currency might not need to be competitors. They could be partners in economic evolution. What does that really mean for the future of money as we know it? A future where value might be inherently linked back to real-world economic output and everyday participation.
It's a fundamental question.
So wrapping this up, what does all this mean for you, the listener, according to Chapter 20? The era of mass economic enlightenment begins seems to offer a future where, for consumers, SETs provide a chance to build wealth passively just by participating in the economy.
Right. And for businesses, SETS-backed transactions create new incentive models. They might drive loyalty and engagement by competing not just on price, but on those SETS pledge rates and sustainability efforts.
And for governments, the chapter suggests SETs could offer a sustainable way to enhance monetary stability without resorting to extreme interventions, simply because money becomes more closely connected to real things.
And this transformation, the chapter argues, doesn't just stabilize fiat, it could also set the stage for mass adoption of digital assets by institutional investors.
How so?
By providing the fundamental economic backing that link to real-world value that many feel has long been missing from purely speculative digital assets. With SETs acting as a bridge, these assets could become viable financial instruments within a more stable, regulated economy, moving beyond just speculation.
The chapter concludes with a pretty powerful statement. The world is on the cusp of this transformation. The only question that remains, who will lead the way?
Leaves you thinking, doesn't it? And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If this vision of a SETS-backed economy, just as described in this chapter, were to actually become a reality, how might your own understanding of wealth and what constitutes an economic contribution fundamentally change? Would you start seeing your everyday purchases, your work, your community involvement as direct contributions to a larger, perhaps more stable and equitable economic system?
Lots to chew on there. We hope this deep dive into Chapter 20 has given you a shortcut to being well-informed about this really intriguing economic concept. Join us next time for another deep dive into your chapters.